Welcome, everybody. My name is Laura Kaifas, and I'm with the Neighborhood Services Office. I'm going to serve as your host today. We'll have a brief presentation, and we will take questions after that. We'll get started in just a minute. We have a few more people still joining us. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat as they come to you, and I'll read them at the end. Be patient. We'll try and get to everyone in the order that we get the questions. We have a bit of a delay sometimes here because of, well, technical reasons, but know that we will get to you. Give it about one more minute and I will turn it over to Steve. If you prefer to ask your questions live, that will also be an option at the end. Thank you, everybody. Steve, why don't you take it from here?
Thank you, Laura. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending today's public meeting. I'm Steve White, Municipal Utilities Business Manager, and joining me today are Interim Deputy City Manager Tom Dunsing and Interim Municipal Utilities Director Tara Ford and Interim Deputy Municipal Utilities Director Mark Weber. Along with included in today's meeting is our consultant who's been with us for a very long time. His name's Kyle Stevens. He comes from our consulting firm Stantec, and he'll be giving today's bulk of the presentation. We're here today to introduce and kick off the 2022 water, wastewater, and stormwater rate study. It's important to us to reach out to the public and communicate and hear your feedback and input as we go through this process. And we look forward to your participation in today's meeting. And we also have another meeting this afternoon at 5:30 p.m. The purpose of any rate study is really to identify the cost to provide water services and wastewater services. And from there, we want to equitably recover the costs from our different customer classifications. That includes single family, multifamily, commercial, industrial, as well as landscape meters and construction meters. Kyle will be going into greater detail into the discussion, and he'll be presenting bulk of the slide deck on our processes for how we equitably and fairly recover those costs. Tempe is in a great position from the fact that we have advanced metering infrastructure, which provides us precise data and just a ton of data, hourly data for all of our different customers from all of our different customer classifications. So with that, it provides great data to evaluate and identify the water demand characteristics for how we apply that to our different customer classifications. One thing you'll notice if you participated in this process previously, we have added stormwater to this rate study. This is the first time for the city of Tempe to be evaluating stormwater costs. So the intent of adding stormwater is to provide options to city council at the end of this process to set a rate to recover the costs for stormwater infrastructure and the maintenance of stormwater infrastructure within the city of Tempe. Part of that process will be peeling away costs from the utility and the city for the operating and capital costs, as I just mentioned, and the different functions related to maintaining that system. So certainly being brand new and something a little different, we certainly expect a lot of communication and discussion on this as we go throughout the rate study process. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Kyle Stevens to start running through the presentation. And as Laura was saying previously, we're here to answer any questions you have following the presentation. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for that introduction, Steve, and it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon to be able to go through this presentation and introduce the rate study that'll be conducted this year. And so with regards to an agenda, we're going to cover in detail, I'll call it at the 30,000 foot view, the core components of a rate study. So that'll include revenue sufficiency, cost allocation, rate design, and then our public outreach and timeline for the rate study. A rate study is going to take several months to complete and get to the recommendation stage. and then we'll get to the questions and discussions. So let's just jump right into it. The best way to think about a rate study is it's really fundamentally a series of interconnected investigations. And so we first start with the revenue sufficiency. That's just a fancy way of saying how much do things cost. And so we'll want to gather a good amount of information in detail from the city, looking at operations, capital, debt costs on an annual basis, and then project that forward for 10 years in order to understand how those costs are anticipated to change over time and how the rates then would need to reflect that. Then we'll move into the cost allocation process. And what we're doing here is figuring out where those costs that we've identified need to be recovered from customers. So there are no taxes in water and wastewater paying for anything. It's all charges for services. And so we look at a detailed x-ray of expenditures to determine what are the cost drivers for the utility. And then as Steve alluded to, the city has a great repository of data relating to how customers actually use the system. And we use that data to figure out where the costs then should be connected and recovered from customer classes. And then finally, we'll talk about rate design, the actual design and configuration of the rates that are charged to customers and that you'll oftentimes see on your utility bill at the end of the month that generates the charges that are due based on the services provided. So we'll jump into details. I figured first would be a few slides here to just set the stage for utilities. As we look over the last 20 years or so, utility costs have been moving up nationwide. And so this comparison here on this slide, you take the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, that's something we oftentimes hear about, the general level and change in price. From 2000, it's been about a 2.4% annual change. The federal government actually tracks, though, the change in water and wastewater bills over that exact same time period as well. And if you look at that metric, it's about 4.7. So it's almost double the change in price over that time period. And the real underlying factor there is utility services are really fundamentally capital intensive. These are very large interconnected systems that are stretching the entirety of the community. And so that basket of goods that a utility is buying is a little different than what, say, a household would buy or a commercial enterprise, and those costs have changed at a little bit of a different level. So that creates kind of some underlying pressure on rates over time and rate changes to keep up with those. Additionally, this next slide just gives us a national comparison. We just put this together and pulled an average bill for about 6,000 gallons of monthly water consumption across the US for multiple municipalities. As part of these rate studies, we always like to compare and contrast the cost for services in different municipalities. What this really shows is, I think, a couple key things. So one is that it can vary greatly across the country, the cost, because different utilities have different supplies, different age of system, different needs that they're addressing. Tempe compares very favorably when you put it on a national stage and compare it to other peer municipalities. The other thing I'll point out here is I've highlighted in a coloring scheme the kind of proportion of the bill in these pie charts for each city, blue being water, green being wastewater, and then purple being stormwater. And I think the importance there is to realize in a number of communities, as Steve mentioned, it'll be part of this rate study, we'll be looking at stormwater costs, and oftentimes cities will elect to actually have a standalone fee on the utility bill to recover those costs that are associated with dealing with precipitation events in the community that reduce flooding. And we'll talk about that a few slides down. So with regards to the revenue sufficiency, we've got basically an analysis that is first grouping all of the costs. So this schematic gives you an idea of all the data points that start to go in and the different costs that a utility incurs in providing services on an annual basis. And so personnel, operations, got many vehicles and specialty equipment that's required to operate the system. I also mentioned debt service is one item. And then capital projects are a very large part of the utilities budget that can vary from year to year. And then we'll have reserve policies and other financial policies that we'll need to consider in order to ensure the utility is financially sustainable and stable over the long term. And all of that goes into essentially create one number that is the total amount of revenue that's required for the utility. And again, we'll be looking at that not only in, say, the budget year, the current year we're in, but then projecting that on a go forward basis so that we can understand and anticipate any changes to that cost that may occur in the next 5 or 10 years. So this schematic just tries to tee up an idea of the relative cost currently to provide first water services. So the glass over on the right side gives you an idea of how those cost components that I just talked about start to stack up. So in the current year that we're in, which is 2022 for the city, debt costs are roughly $23 million on an annual basis. The city intends to invest roughly $27 million in capital infrastructure across the water system, and an operating cost are $34 million. These will change slightly over time. It gives you an idea of the magnitude of the costs that are required to operate the system. And a very similar look on this particular graphic, we've got kind of the cost to drain a tub or provide wastewater services over here. Debt cost on an annual basis are $16 million. The city intends to invest roughly $16 million as well, and operating costs are roughly $14 million in this fiscal year. Now, with regards to stormwater, it's a little bit of a different analysis this year. So what we're really fundamentally looking to do in the first stage is identify the ways and the cost that the city provides stormwater services. And so off to the right here, you can see this kind of cost identification. Those are either things like street sweeping in order to get debris and catch it before it goes into the stormwater system, asset management, regulatory compliance. And currently, these items are spread through various departments. So for instance, much of the operations cost is currently in utilities, where the capital investment cost has been funded historically through GEO bonds, which are go to referendum and are issued by the city to pay for those capital costs. And so we'll be identifying that full suite of stormwater services as part of this study, and then again, projecting it out in order to ensure that we can anticipate any changes to those costs. Now next, once we've established that the revenue requirement, we then move to cost allocation. And cost allocation is really, in the best way I can describe it, is taking a really deep dive into expenses, almost like an X-ray. And what this graphic does right here is tease up what we're trying to do at the end of the process. So we'll go line by line. We'll talk with and work with the city subject matter experts to understand each cost in the utility, what's driving those costs. And then we're going to create a map like the one that's shown here. And the best way to think about this is it starts on the left, and it follows the water from the source all the way to the right to your home or your business. And so first, we've got to figure out our source of supply, the cost of that supply. Then once we've got the water, we've got to treat the water to ensure it's to proper standards. Then it'll go out into the transmission or distribution system, the pipe network. And finally, it'll arrive to the customer. And we will be essentially identifying for each of these steps in the service provision model what the underlying cost is to provide that on an annual basis. We'll then attach that on the bottom side of this graphic to the demands that the system is meeting. And these demands are cut into several different categories. And so the first one down on the bottom is average day demands. Average day demands is just simply thinking about the overall demands that the city has to provide as far as the quantity of water on a daily basis. But one of the things that will become very important as we look at max day and peak hour are peaking demand. So as we build a water system out, the water system has to stand ready 24/7 to provide service to Tempe's customers, and it has to be sized in such a way that it can meet maximum demands when they occur. And so we'll be categorizing the cost associated with those and cleanly in this schematic attaching those costs to the buckets and the demands that the city is meeting. Now, this process is an industry standard process. And so this is really my title by the book. M1 is the book. It's the industry standard of how you allocate these costs. And Tempe has followed this process for a number of years in previous rate studies to ensure that we're looking at these costs, and allocate them in the exact way that the industry specifies that we do it. Now, with regards to the cost allocation process, you can go through and you can identify those costs and the way that the city is meeting it through those average or max day demands. One of the key items, though, that Tempe has that many other communities don't currently is really, really detailed customer data. And so the automated metering infrastructure is providing millions and millions of data points for us to analyze. And what this leads to is essentially an ability to be very thorough and thoughtful and accurate in the way that we're allocating costs and connecting that to the way that customers are actually using the system. This particular chart right here shows an example of different customer classes and their usage over a year. This was actually from the last study that we conducted 2 years ago. We're currently just getting this updated data and looking at how things have changed since that study was conducted. But you can clearly see on this graphic some peaking activity, some seasonal demands that take place in the summer months where a lot more water is demanded from many of the customer classes that are connected to the system over time. So we'll switch gears. On the wastewater side of the equation, wastewater will actually, from a cost allocation standpoint, be new to this study. So we have not conducted a wastewater cost of service in a number of years, but we will be as part of this study. And so wastewater cost allocation is a bit different. What we're looking at on the wastewater side is really 3 parameters. So one is going to be the total amount of wastewater, the flow, if you will. The next is going to be the strength. And in the industry, that is defined as COD and TSS. Those are 2 acronyms. The first stands for chemical oxygen demand. The second stands for TSS, or total suspended solids. These are really just a way to quantify the strength or what's in the wastewater and how much it costs to then treat that wastewater before it can be disposed of. And so this will be an analysis that we'll be looking again to true up and understand the cost of wastewater services. I would also add that, Tempe is also bringing another really great component of data here with a customer sampling study where we're actually looking at different customer classes and the wastewater strength that they are supplying to the system that then needs to be treated. So much like the water side, we'll have a compatible data source that we can draw from to divide those costs up to be as accurate and proportional as we possibly can be. And then finally, this schematic right here kind of tells the story of what we do once we have the cost allocation. So first, in the orange bars, when we're done with a cost allocation process, we'll have an amount of revenue, and that is shown by the height of these bars. There's no numbers here, but I'm talking through the relative comparison we do. So cost of service will define how much money we need from each customer class based on their overall usage of the system. We'll then compare that to the black bars, which is how much revenue each customer class is currently generating. And where there's a gap there, we'll want to think about strategies in order to close that gap. Ideally, these 2 bars over time would be as close to equal as possible, which essentially means that each customer class is paying for their proportional share of overall system costs to run the system. Now we'll move on to the final part of the rate study. So once we've identified how much money we need, which customer class it's coming from, we'll then start to talk about the different elements of rate design and what goes into creating rates. So first is really teeing up the idea of the balancing objectives. So when we go into rate design, it's helpful to have in our minds that we're finding a middle path, if you will, between multiple objectives that can oftentimes be competing. And what do I mean by that? So one would be simplicity. Oftentimes an objective is to have simple and understandable rates. You could imagine, though, where you could charge a flat rate, the same rate to everyone. I would argue that maybe is not as proportional as we want. Another competing goal is the idea that we want rates to be sensitive enough to pick up how customers are using services and allow for that bill to change based on the use of services. And so simplicity, proportionality are often items that we think about and we talk about as we go to design rates. On the top side of the screen, I have the cost of service. So those results that come out and tell us, hey, are we recovering enough revenue? Are we not recovering enough revenue from each customer class? We'll want to take that into account as we design rates in order to ensure, again, comport with those cost of service findings. And finally, there's a number of industry standards, best practices, local precedent that we'll want to take into account as we set rates and generate the rates that will be charged to customers. So how do we build water rates? So this is a graphic that starts to talk about how we're very thoughtful about the way that we attach different cost components to the water rate structure. So I'll take a minute to go through this. On the left side, we've got the cost components that we just talked about in the cost of service for water. So those are customers' cost, average day, and then some of the peaking costs, max and peak hour costs. With regards to these costs, we want to be thoughtful about which part of the rate structure they go to. So customer costs don't have anything to do with volumetric demands. These are best thought about as billing or customer service type functions. Those are often best recovered in customer charges or fixed service charges, the flat fee that customers will pay before any fees are levied based on volumetric usage. Now, average day cost, the overall average cost of providing services, that oftentimes is partly recovered in fixed service charges, and then the rest of it is in volume. And then peak demands at the bottom of this are best recovered in volumetric demands. And so a lot to go up in here. I think the two main points to take away is there are two parts of rates. One's going to be fixed, and then one's going to be volumetric on the water and wastewater side. And we're going to be very thoughtful about the underlying costs that underpin those rates and make sure that they are the kinds of costs that are best recovered in each of those two components of rates. Now, how do we measure usage? So on the fixed service charges, we measure that by the connection size to the system. And so this can be multiple different sizes. It's usually measured in inches. You can think of a single family home as typically having a 5/8 connection, but they can scale up to much larger connections for commercial or industrial type uses. And then for volumetric, we're talking about thousands of gallons of usage within a monthly period. So next, I'll talk about the current rates. Before we make any modifications or recommendations as part of this year's study, it's good to have a good underpinning of where we stand today. So these two schedules are the current rates that are in place for water services within Tempe. On the left side are the fixed service charges. Now, most residential homes will be up there at the 5/8 inch. There are a few that maybe have a larger meter. Maybe they're meeting irrigation demands or other demands that would require more pressure and more volume. But you can see as the size of the meter goes up, those fixed charges before any volume cost will additionally go up. So that represents the fact that those meters can place much, much larger demands on the system. When we move to the right, we then have a series of volume charges. And these are customer class specific and based on the amount of usage that a customer uses in each monthly period. So I'll break these down. For the single family customer class, there are 5 individual tiers. And what I mean by tiers is there are volume allotments with a given price for that. So tier 1 is from 0 to 6,000 gallons of usage monthly. And for any volume falling in there, it's $1.90 per 1,000 gallons. Now, if your usage goes above 6,000, you would then move into tier 2. So that'd be 7 to 12,000 gallons of usage, and at $2.91. And the tier 3, 4, and 5 will follow that exact same kind of logic. Whereas you fall into the tier, the volume that falls into that given tier will be charged at the rate for that tier that's shown on the right here. Now, in addition to single family, we also have several other customer classes: multifamily, commercial, construction, industrial, and landscaping. Now, all of those are billed what's known as a uniform rate, or a rate for all usage. They're still billed on the amount of volumetric usage at the month, but it's a flat rate for all usage, and the rates are shown to the right here. So for example, multifamily is $2.11 for all 1,000 gallon usage on a given meter in a monthly time period. Now, wastewater rates are going to look very similar from the service charges standpoint. On the left side of the screen, again, by meter size, the larger the connection to the system, the larger that monthly fee that gets charged to the account before any calculation of usage. So an average single family home, again, just for reference, would be normally a 5/8 meter. There are some that are a little bit larger, so that'd be $10.30 a month. Now on the right side, we've got the volumetric charges. So those are a little bit different than water. So for single family, there are a number of calculations that go into calculating the billable amount. So first, there's a return flow factor, which is roughly 70% of the winter average usage. So what this means is we're looking at only the usage between January and March, and then taking 70% of that to generate the amount of billable units. And then if it's higher than 12,000, we cap it at 12,000. So that calculation is trying to ensure that we don't bill folks for irrigation type usage that's not returning back to the wastewater system. And so for those billable units, it's currently at $1.84 per 1,000 gallons going back to the wastewater system. Then you can see down below this, we again have several other customer classes. Multifamily has its own with the same rate as residential at 184, but a different return flow factor. And then commercial is broken out into very individualized categories depending on the type of activity that's happening at that location. And again, what we're really concerned with on the wastewater side is understanding the strength of that wastewater. And so these charges, as we go to update them, will be incorporating the cost that Tempe incurs when it sends wastewater to Phoenix for treatment right now. And we'll be understanding how these different customer classes contribute to that cost to generate these rate differentials that you're seeing on the right for wastewater services. Now, from a benchmarking standpoint, we often, as we go into rate studies, will want to first look at a graphic like this one, which compares where we currently stand. So on the left side of this screen, these are AMWA communities, which stands for Arizona Municipal Water Users Association. These are kind of peer municipalities in the valley. You can think of them like that. What we have is an average residential customer here who's using 10,000 gallons of water, 7,000 gallons of wastewater. What I take away from this survey is that Tempe has very competitive services for this average single family home. You can see down there, Tempe is only one rung above the bottom on this particular survey for the average user. On the right side of the screen, what we have done is change the volume metric level here. So this is what I would categorize as a large volume user, 75,000 gallons of water a month and 35,000 gallons of wastewater. What you'll see similarly on this particular survey is Tempe again falls into the lower third of this particular survey, again providing very competitive services compared to other peer municipalities locally in the valley. Now, as we go through the study and have any recommendations, we oftentimes will have a graphic like this that will compare what the new rates would look like as well. So with regards to changing gears from water to wastewater, stormwater, the new one that's been added to this particular rate study, I'm going to use a little bit of different terminology here. So once we've identified cost, what we are looking to do as part of this study is to provide the community and council with essentially several options in which a policy direction could be made in how to recover stormwater costs. And stormwater costs and fees for other municipalities, they often take a deep analysis into looking at essentially a standalone fee. We want it to have several characteristics. So we want it to be fair, equitable, simple to administer, defensible, have an easy understanding, and then we want to also consider the locally available data. And the way that we measure stormwater usage is very different oftentimes than water or wastewater. So down at the bottom here, I've put in several different metrics that different communities across the country, even within Arizona, will use in order to recover stormwater services cost. And so taxable value, if it's in the general fund, much of the general fund revenue can often comes from taxable value that can be used to pay for stormwater. A flat fee, whether that's per utility account, per meter. Flat fees are very common in Arizona for the ones that do have environmental or stormwater fees. Dwelling units, so the number of living units at a particular premise is another one that comes into play. And then we get into a category of parcel-specific type characteristics. So gross area, how big is the parcel? I'm kind of thinking about runoff and how do different parcels impact the amount of runoff that the system receives. Then pervious area, so thinking about the areas that are still in maybe a natural state, there can still percolate water. And then finally impervious area, those hard surfaces that really change the hydraulic nature of a given parcel and how much runoff is created on it. And so we'll be taking a real deep dive into these different bases and making some recommendations as part of this study on which ones would best fit Tempe. So with regards to the rate study and the public outreach timeline, we are currently in the March through April time period. We've just kicked off the study in March, collecting data and having a number of meetings like this one today, where we're introducing the rate study and the topics associated with it. We also want to solicit and collect public feedback. And I can tell you, for doing a number of these studies, Tempe is great at having these meetings, getting feedback, and ensuring that we can incorporate them into the rate study as we go through the process. Now, as we move into the March through July period, that's really when the in-depth analysis is occurring. So we're going through, we're building models, we're integrating all the latest and greatest local data that's available to come up with modifications and recommendations as part of the study, which will be summed up in a presentation in the August and September period, which again will trigger a public outreach event in order to gather feedback and recommendations. I'll also mention that this is typically a time where we have an understanding of how those changes or modifications would impact different customers within the community. Now, in the October and November time period, that's when we expect to go to council for consideration of any of those modifications or changes to the rates. And then if adopted, that would then lead to a public outreach campaign to inform customers what they should expect and how their rates will change going into 2023. And finally, in the orange box here, the earliest that any of these changes or modifications would impact customers would be in January 2023. So with that, I'll conclude the formal presentation. And then we'll take any particular questions or discussions. I'd be happy to address those. Steve, I think you're muted. There you go.
Thanks, Kyle. With that, I'll certainly open it up to any verbal questions, but as Laura mentioned earlier, you're welcome to also include any questions you may have in the chat. Laura, I'm not sure if anyone's put any questions in the chat so far, but
so far not seeing any. And again, I'll beg you a little bit of patience from you guys. My screen has a bit of a weird delay and keeps going black. So if I don't ask it right away, hang in there. But so far, nothing.
I see a question from Kendon.
Kendon, yes. Kendon, go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation today. I have a question about why the 40,000 plus gallons is $5.58, which is only 50 cents more than the 21 to 40,000 gallon usage in the residential.
A great question. So I'm going to go back a few slides, and I think what you're referring to is on our water rates down here on the bottom. Was it the tier 5 essentially is the one you're looking at? Okay. So the tier pricing in residential, the way that these are calculated, as I mentioned, we're very careful to consider the way that the system was designed, right? And it's meeting 3 types of demands, really. Average demands, maximum day, and peak hours. And the size of the pipes, the plant, all have to be sized from an engineering perspective to meet those demands. This pricing right here is calculated mathematically directly out of the way that the volume is essentially connected to those demands. And so what I mean by that is when you look at tier 1, for instance, that 0 for 6,000, those demands are very steady throughout the year. Those are demands oftentimes are associated with indoor usage. When we go into the higher tiers, though, those higher tiers will have very seasonal changes in usage, use more of those different demands, those peak demands. This costing that comes out is directly mathematically related to the cost that utility incurs on an annual basis to ensure that that service is available year round. And I make that distinction because that is oftentimes not the case around the country where communities don't have this type of data available. We're able to connect the cost in such a linear way.
So my follow-up to that is you're being very clear that the cost is associated with the utility burden. However, it does not appear as though it is accounting for the environmental burden that these high water users are putting on the system. And so my question is, for only 50 cents more, how much water is being used by if 80% of the population is within the tier 1 and tier 2 system, and then 20%, and I'm not sure what the numbers are, but to articulate my point here, if 20% of the population is in 3, 4, and 5, how is this pricing then accounting for the exponentially high environmental impacts that they are putting on the desert, in addition to the kind of infrastructure demands that they're putting onto? How is that being accounted for in the pricing? Because it looks like the largest jump is from 2 to 3, second largest jump is from 3 to 4, and then there's a relatively small jump from 4 to 5.
Yeah, so it's a great question. First, you're absolutely right. You know, when you look at that pricing, when you get above tier 2, you go into tier 3, 4, and 5. That's when you see a lot more seasonal changes in demands, and that's why the pricing jumps up pretty significantly there. With regards to cost, when we traditionally set utility rates, we're looking at purely the cost of operating the system on an annual basis. We don't necessarily consider the external costs that may be, and I'm not saying they're not there, but in the traditional sense of setting utility rates and the way these are set, it is purely based on the cost to run and operate the system and the demands that we're meeting.
So I understand that, but there is conservation goals set by the city council that appear, based off of your presentation, are not being incorporated into the pricing structure. Therefore, there's an opportunity here to accelerate water conservation by incorporating pricing that accurately accounts for the environmental impacts that are currently not being included in this pricing structure. How can that be adjusted for in the future in order to continue to advance our water conservation goals?
So I would say, and there you might be some staff that can address this too, but I would say the utility is addressing conservation in 2 ways. So one is just from a pure cost standpoint, this does generate a conservation signal, right? So we are seeing increasing in cost here going forward. That does result in, over time, we've added, like the last rates that we added a 5th tier, which increased the amount of essentially cost for that top amount of water for the seasonal demands. These rates, as they currently stand, I would argue, do have a pretty heavy conservation signaling to them. They are recognizing that as you increase the cost that the utilities incurred, you have to pay for that proportionally. I would also add that there are programs available, like the conservation program, that the utility oftentimes directs customers to if they want to conserve, and gives them options in how to conserve and reduce their demands on the system.
Well, I appreciate that account. I will end my statement with that I would like to see this rate study do significantly more to accelerate water conservation. I'm not sure if you saw the report that came out regarding the Coyote Gulch water basin, but this was out of the city of Page, in the sense that the Glen Canyon Dam release could only accomplish, part of what it serves through the water outlet works. And we're hitting a point where we will no longer be able to pull water out of these reservoirs because they're dropping so far below. So anything that we are doing to not just conserve water by putting pricing, but actively replace water through these increased costs for the high water users that are putting exponential demand on our environment is something I would like the city to explore through these rate studies. Thank you.
Thanks, Kendon. We'll go on to Michael, and hopefully my screen doesn't go black. Can you talk about the situation with currently how water cost is balancing versus revenue? Are we balancing now? And projections for cost for the coming years? Do we have any projection on what kind of percentage cost of supply we're looking at? Thanks, Michael.
I can hop in there on that, Kyle. If I understand the question correctly, are you talking about the type of percentage of rate increase, or are we talking about the supply of water?
So I think I'm basically asking, we're balancing now, I believe that's accurate, where our cost for the utility versus what we're bringing in revenue. And then the second part of the question is, do we have a projection for what we expect the cost of supply to go up over the coming years? So if we have any kind of, do we have a projection for next year? Do we have a projection for 10 years, et cetera?
And that's a great question. And we're in the process of coming up with those projections. So we're in the middle of the rate study. So when we come back in August with the recommendations of the rate study, we'll have that. We're just at the point where we're collecting data for now so we don't have that to share at this point.
I guess maybe I'm making an inaccurate assumption that we buy water from the Colorado River or whatever. Do we expect the cost of us acquiring water in Tempe to go up?
Yes, in fact, it is going up. So one of the unique things about the city of Tempe is the CAP water. Colorado River water is one of the, we have the smallest portion in our raw water portfolio, surface water of any city in the valley that I'm aware of. So the vast majority of our water comes from Salt River Project. About 90% of it is Salt River Project water. It fluctuates between about 5 and 8% annually for our CAP water costs as far as purchasing raw water. So with that said, costs are increasing. We budget for those increases. There's 5-year projections from CAP themselves on what those costs would be from a tier shortage standpoint. Obviously, we're already in tier 1, projected to be in tier 2 and tier 3 in the near future. And those costs are incorporated as part of this rate study.
Okay, thanks for that. Matt, did you want to go ahead with your question?
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation today. It's been very insightful. My question, I apologize, is probably going to overlap with Kendon's just a little bit. But what is the goal of, what is Tempe's goal for water? It seems to me that it's more focused at encouraging equitable rates and not so much towards encouraging conservation. Again, there's some overlap with Kendon's statements earlier, but when I think about equitable, a lot of times you think about low water usage or lower usage of whatever whatever it may be. But in the case of water, when I think about equitable, I think about, are the high water usage customers getting away with using more water for cheaper? So when you look at these rates, what I see is exactly that. It appears that 40,000 gallons a month is getting water much, much cheaper than the 0 to 6,000 gallons. So is the goal to ensure that equity in the rates, or is the goal to encourage conservation?
So I can answer the first part of that. So I just do want to clarify for tier 1, if we're looking at this graphic, the price per thousand is $1.90. If you start to use quite a bit more water, for instance, if you get up to tier 5, it's $5.58 per 1,000 gallons. And so it does scale. The more usage you use, you're going to pay more for each 1,000 gallons as you go into those tier. And that's all cost-based right now.
And I do understand that. I guess what I would like to see the city of Tempe do is encourage those high usage customers to use less water. And I think it's easy to say, right? But I think one of the ways that we can do that as a city is to up the fees per 1,000 gallons to a price that's, and I'm doing very quick math here. So if you're 5,000 gallons a month and compared to 40,000 gallons a month, in my brain, that needs to be 8 times higher, right? 5 times 8 is 40,000. And that's not how it's set. And I understand that there are some cost of production in there, and that's what the rates are based on. But I would like to see the city of Tempe encourage conservation through rates.
Thanks for
And
that.
Laura, I can speak on that for a second regarding water conservation. Tempe does have a very robust water conservation program as well, where we address a lot of the questions that you and Kendon had. And like I said, we have the robust water conservation plan, plus we have our drought preparedness and resiliency plans that we have out there too. And we're also building our water portfolio, our water resources portfolio, to plan, to be very proactive in planning in case there was a drought to hit Tempe. And so we're coming at it from 2 angles. Let's just say we have to focus on the water rates and what's put into that. What infrastructure do we need in order to deliver the amount of water that the demand in the system? So we look at that, and then on the other side we have water conservation as well. So it's 2 programs that work simultaneously with one another to address both topics, I guess you could say, for the residents of Tempe, so that enough water is being delivered and treated, because we have to look at the treatment side as well. And then conservation to assist wherever we can, whether it be with individual homeowners or industries or businesses. We have water conservation programs for all of our customer classes.
Thanks, Tara.
Mhm.
Okay, there's a question from Philip. Will there be a way to account for water used in gardens and other such uses in a single family unit that can be, screen went black, give me a minute here. That can be subtracted from wastewater calculations. I believe there may already be such a process, but it may not be widely known by the public.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to just comment on that from a single family customer standpoint. Tempe does use essentially a couple different things to get at and ensure that we're billing as equitably as possible on the wastewater side. So the first is doing winter averaging and only looking at those bills through January, February, and March, the usage that's occurring. The second is using return flow, so only billing for 70% of the usage in those months. And then the third is capping the total amount of wastewater volume that can be billed for single family at 12,000 gallons monthly. And so through those 3 different mechanisms, we're trying to ensure we account for outdoor usage that may not come back to the system.
Kyle, I might just add to that for a second. I think Philip is also referring to a form that you used to be able to fill out if you had outdoor water use or a certain amount of turf or that type of thing. That form and the ability to reduce your outdoor water use or take into account your outdoor water use during winter average went away when we capped it at 12,000 gallons for return flow.
Okay, and Kendon has some further comments. If outdoor water use, screen's black, sorry, is the largest. Sorry, if anyone can maybe read it, Stephen, my screen keeps.
I'm happy to restate it.
Yeah, please, if you would.
So an analysis of single-family resident water use, outdoor water use was the largest portion that has the ability to be conserved. So why then in the landscape rate, water rates, is it less than residential for volume charges? I think it was the slide after this. But before you launch into that, I did want to respond to Tara's comment. We are absolutely in a drought, and the Colorado Code Red, or the Colorado River Code Red, is an example that we need to be doing significantly more, significantly faster in order to address this. So it's not about if Tempe experiences a drought, but when. So I just wanted to throw that in there, and there's a link in the chat to a Washington Post about the Colorado River mega drought. But going back to the landscape ones, I believe that's, yep, the slide where it says all use for $4.08 as opposed to the single family or multifamily.
Yeah, so Happy to talk about that for a second. Again, these rates for each customer class, we're looking at their particular usage. Landscape, as you mentioned, is outdoor usage. You can see kind of comparing that rate. It has one of the highest volumetric rates compared to, say, multifamily, commercial, industrial, between those other customers, because it is so seasonal. And again, all usage is charged at that rate. So if you can contrast against single family for some of the lower tiers, it's 190, 290 for the first tier, but it's going to be all at 408, which includes the full cost and the seasonal demands that are placed on the system from that customer class. So they are paying for their full cost is one way to say it.
Okay. Another question here about stormwater fee. How can the stormwater fee have a more holistic approach, like tackling climate action through shade, cooling, and water conservation? I'd like to see this fee go towards these intersectional projects.
Yeah, and I'd maybe just start the response to that one, and just where we're at today is probably the first step on a stormwater fee. So we are just getting our arms around the cost, identifying how the city is providing these services, and we'll identify then potentially options for maybe a standalone rate if council so chooses to go that direction to recover those costs. I would then think oftentimes, as I've done studies and looked at stormwaters, that as the utility matures or those fees mature, other elements can be brought in that address the different things that are happening. Green infrastructure is always a big one that comes up as well. Those items can be incorporated into a stormwater utility or fees oftentimes later down on the road once you've got it established.
Thank you for that. And just so you know, I appreciate all that you're doing for this. I think this is incredibly timely and needed. And so the urgency in my voice is not criticism as much as a desire to see this work accelerated. And so bringing these comments up for me underscores the need that the environment must be included as a stakeholder alongside our residents, our businesses, etc., in a way that accelerates water conservation and water restoration. So it's been mentioned multiple times that the utilities need to be recovered in terms of costs, but the environmental costs also need to be recovered. So making sure that that is front of mind as these types of ideas and conservative tactic or conservation tactics are employed are core to the tone of these recommendations that I, as a both resident of Tempe, someone who works in Tempe, have grown up in Tempe, want to see in the future of my city and this work. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Kendon. Philip says, I would like to see financial incentives for implementing rainwater collection storage. Sorry, blacked out again. On single family units that could be used on the unit's landscape and edible plants, gardens. Okay, I don't know that that's really a question, more of a comment. Another follow-up question here. It sounds like the tier 5 rate of 50 cents per 1,000 gallons higher was added in the most recent study. Did the city see a decrease in water usage in the tier 4, 5 as a result of that increase? If not, what is the amount of higher cost for high usage customers that would actually cause a behavior change?
So that's something we'll be able to evaluate this year, since we'll have data and we'll be able to look at the most recent trends over a multi-year period since that rate's been in effect, and understand, potentially how customer usage has changed over time. And what was the second part of that question? I think it was it the cost-based?
Yeah, what would cause an actual behavior change?
Yeah, so that's I can answer that one way, just knowing I've done a lot of different rate changes over time. Customers, it's always interesting how they respond to pricing. Certain households will respond right away to rate increases, just normal ones, and reduce usage. Certain ones can be very price insensitive, and you can continue to increase price and they will not change usage. And so it is very individualized how customers respond, look at their utility bill, and then change their individual usage. But it is something that on an ongoing basis, especially with this large repository data, that we have our eye on and that we're tracking and understanding as we complete these studies.
Thanks, Kyle. Matt, you had two more?
Yes, these are very simple questions. How is the landscaping customer class, how is that policed? Is that just policed based on permits, or how is that price per gallon assessed?
Well, I'll kick that off and Kyle can jump in if you would like. So the landscape meter is unique because it's strictly for outdoor use. So what you see most customers that have landscape meters are multifamily units, commercial customers, industrial customers. So all of their outdoor water usage would come through the landscape meter, whether it's drip irrigation or whether they have mature trees or whatever in their landscaping. And the reason that landscape meter classification exists is there's no return flow to it. It's all outdoor water use, so there's no wastewater component to that utility bill. So with that said, it's a cost-based approach to billing that as setting the rate for that, as Kyle has said and discussed in his presentation. So and it's billed at for the very first 1,000 gallons for all usage through monthly usage. So Kyle, do you have anything to add to that?
I think the only other, question was the policing. I think the determination on customer classes is made upon installing, right, and the actual physical infrastructure connection to the system, and then they're placed into that landscape category.
So is that a class that is not normally used, pardon the verbiage, in the single family class? So you can't be a landscape class and a single family class. Is that my understanding?
Actually, with single family customers could choose to install a landscape meter. It becomes a little cost prohibitive though, Matt, because you have to pay system development fees whenever you have to get a permit, water permit, to pay for the meter, pay system development fees, pay tap fees because they have to tap the main. So you're looking at a lot of upfront costs to add a landscape meter to a single family resident. But if you were to do that, you could. There's no rule against doing that.
I'm going to circle back to conservation again, kind of based on what we just talked about there. So in the case of a 40,000 gallon a month single family household, where are those 40,000 gallons going? Are they going into a pool? Are they going into a fountain? Are they going onto turf? Are they going into landscaping?
I would say that would be very individual based on the customer, the single family customer.
So could you encourage a 40,000 gallon a month customer to decrease usage by putting them on a landscape customer class instead of their single family tier 5 class, or perhaps in addition to their single family tier 5 class?
So the landscape meter, just to be clear, is a totally different. It's as if you have a standalone meter that's just serving those outdoor demands, and then they would have an additional meter in the case of a single family home that would be serving the house. So they would actually have to have two separate meters to qualify for that classification.
Perfect. Okay, that's good. That's excellent. That clarifies a couple of things there. So the 40,000 gallons a month is probably going into a pool or being used within the household, not necessarily on turf.
Yeah, maybe one way I could answer that, and again, I think Steve's exactly right. It's individualized where that water goes. But one thing I can tell you is looking at the entire system is, and we had that chart up a second ago, there are big changes in demands between the months. And when you look at the summer months and those seasonal months, we see a lot more water being demanded by not only single family, but commercial as well. For uses that would likely represent something that happens this summer, whether it's irrigation or the pool, like you mentioned. There's probably a number of demands that are placed that are higher in those periods of time.
Thank you, guys. And I will kind of echo Kendon again, and I don't mean to keep following Kendon, but my questions are also not out of anger or out of, I'm not trying to do a gotcha. This is a very, very timely study. I think that Tempe has an opportunity to not only keep their lead in conservation, but jump light years ahead with this study. So I'm very encouraged to see this, and I look forward to the next few months.
All right. I do not see any further questions. Thank you from Michael. We appreciate that. Hopefully the second meeting today, my computer will quit overheating and we'll be able to do a little bit better job reading your questions, everybody. But thanks for attending, and this recording will be put on our website probably in about a day or so. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.